Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Truman, the host of today's conversation. The Denison Forum podcast is a place where we have conversations about culture and faith, how those things interact and weave together, and how you and I can live as influential, redemptive, salt and light believers in the mean world and the mean time before we see Jesus face to face. I just have to share with you that as a pastor, and like many Christians, I have at times been befuddled by the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And today we're going to have a conversation about that part of Scripture and how it speaks to us in a powerful way today. We're going to do that through a new book written by Scot McKnight and Cody Matchett. The book is called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. The authors, let me give you a little bit of background on them. Scot McKnight is professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. He is also the author of more than 80 books, including the award-winning book, The Jesus Creed, as well as a book called The King Jesus Gospel, and another one called One Life. He also wrote The Blue Parakeet and Kingdom Conspiracy. He also maintains an active blog at christianitytoday.com/Scot-McKnight. He and his wife, Kristen, live in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, where they enjoy long walks, gardening, and cooking. Cody Matchett is a teacher, writer, and pastor from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He is also a PhD student in New Testament, focusing on Paul and character in the Greco-Roman world. And he is the co-author of this book with Dr. McKnight. He lives in the Beltline of Calgary with his wife, Brianna, and their two children, a son and a daughter. So we're welcoming them to the Denison Forum podcast today. I think you will be fascinated by this conversation. So today, the book is Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as dissident disciple. I'm going to have to get used to the word dissident. And so we want to welcome Dr. McKnight and Pastor Cody to the podcast. Would you guys like to say hello?
Great to be here.
Good to be with you, Mark. Thank you for this invitation.
Well, yes. Glad to be a part of the conversation. And just want to get a little bit of background information. Here's my general take on how I've approached the book of Revelation. You outlined it pretty well in the opening part of your book, which is we're all excited as pastors to go and preach about the seven churches and then to skip to the end of the book and talk about the new heaven and the new earth. And we're excited about that. And we just try not to stir too much of the water beyond that. In my last pastorate, where I helped plant a church and stayed for 25 years, I had one what I would call rabid Revelation fan who asked me, he asked me at least twice a year when I was starting a new sermon series about something. It was always, Pastor Mark, when are you going to talk about Revelation? When are you going to preach Revelation? When are you going to get into the whole thing? And so we would have conversations about that. So I'm pleading guilt here at the beginning and seeking forgiveness for being one of those. But tell me a little bit for each of you, what has been your journey to your own perspective and understanding of the book of Revelation, and why did you decide to write this book together?
Yeah, I can take the lead on that one. I've often said at the beginning of Gordon Fee's great little commentary on Revelation, he says, there are really two ways that people come to Revelation. Either they avoid it in despair, or they take an exaggerated interest in it. And I probably would have been the avoid and despair camp and less the exaggerated interest in it. And that's probably true for people in my age category. The book of Revelation puzzles and confounds. It seems so strange when you enter in. It's not stories like about Jesus or arguments like in the letters. You get beasts and dungeons and dragons and bottomless pits, and it just tends to confound. And so I think for me, as someone who didn't grow up in the church, came into the church in my 20s, I had no reference point for what this was. And so I knew that there was that good part about the slaughtered lamb, and the rest of it, I didn't know what was going on. And so I tended to avoid it in despair. That's probably been more my approach. And then, as I joked about off air, coming into the book of Revelation, for me, when Scott invites you to be a part of a project, you say yes, no matter what it is. And so I was delighted that it was Revelation. But Scott's story is much different than mine.
Yeah, I grew up with dispensationalism. My first Bible that I purchased was a Morocco leather Schofield Bible, and
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I never paid that much attention to the notes. I guess I read them, but I didn't know what was going on. But my church was dispensational, pre-trib. Didn't talk a lot about it. My dad didn't talk a lot about it, and he was a Sunday school teacher. And but I got rabidly interested in it my senior year in high school, so I was about 17, and read the book that gave rise to Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth. It was by Salem Kurban, called Guide to Survival, and it was written for those who were not raptured, who were in the tribulation, and it would be a guide for them to know how to live. So I grew up with that, but then started studying a little bit more in college, and by the time I was doing my PhD in Jewish literature and stuff, I had read a lot of apocalyptic literature, all that was in print at the time that I knew about. And I just became convinced in a sort of passive way that this is not what I grew up with is not the way to read this book. And so I looked forward to the day when I could write about it. I only was able to lecture 1 or 2 times a year for an hour or so about Revelation. And I was just always kind of tinkering with it, reading about it, reading the book, of course, and had ideas. And then when I decided to teach a class, Cody was with me, and we began working on it together. So he knows more about it than I do.
I'll bet he's not going to agree with that statement at all. Well, I'll paint my own picture as a word of testimony, because it's not unlike the two of you in some ways. But I didn't come to faith until I was 17, a junior in high school, about 1980. And the first time I ever experienced a person open the Bible and show me something in it, they turned to the book of Revelation.
Oh,
now,
no.
The reason for that was because of what Scott was referring to, this decades-long experience of dispensational theology. But what was happening is I was with some friends at one of their houses. We were watching a movie, and it happened to be, some people will remember the Gregory Peck movie, The Omen, the first iteration of that movie, which is full of themes and ideas of dispensational theology from the book of Revelation. And I didn't like this movie. The host could tell that I was scared, and I wasn't a Christian yet. And he said, well, all of this is based on the Bible. And I said, no, there's no way that that's based on the Bible. And at that point in my life, I'd never even opened a Bible, didn't even own a Bible at that point. So he reached over, grabbed his Bible off the end table, opened it to the book of Revelation. He said, no, what the movie's talking about here is referenced right here. And so it's somewhat of a miracle I ever became a Christian after that experience.
Indeed.
But it wasn't very much longer that that same person bought me a Bible, told me to start at Matthew 1, not Revelation 1, but Matthew 1. And then that began a series of conversations. Now, the other thing, talking about Scott's testimony, is within a year of becoming a Christian, one of those friends that was instrumental in my conversion said, hey, we need to read this book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And so that was the first discipleship, if you want to call it that, experience that I had in a small experience of Bible study and biblical themes. And so I've lived in that same world. And of course, in our part of the world, at least, we've lived in a fairly saturated time of a dispensational, the way you describe it in the book, speculative approach to the book of Revelation. But for our audience, Scott, could you just give us the thumbnail explanation of what is dispensational theology and interpretation that has become so popular in our culture around the book of Revelation and some other writings? And then how is that different from what you're presenting in this book?
A thumbnail, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Dispensationalism. Here's an interesting feature. I'm going to say this. Um, you have to read hard into the truly academic side of dispensationalism to hear some of this stuff. But the first element of dispensationalism is a distinction. I don't even think we talk about this in the book, is a distinction between the earthly people of God and the heavenly people of God. The heavenly people of God's a church, the earthly people is Israel. Well, that's an old element of dispensationalism that just doesn't really get talked about very much. The second element is to divide the Bible into 7 dispensations. And in each dispensation, God works for the redemption of individual people in a different way. So under Moses, they had to follow the law. Under, let's say, Eden, the covenant with Adam and Eve, they had to not eat the true tree. In the new covenant, you have to follow the redemption that is in Christ, etc. So that's sort of a way of reading the Bible. So the first way is a distinction between the heavenly and the earthly people of God. The second one is a way of reading the Bible. A hermeneutic is what we call it in the seminary. But the third one is what most people think dispensationalism is, because most people think of dispensationalism in terms of what is called pop dispensationalism. And that is, we're talking about the rapture, where all the believers will be scooped up into the sky to meet Jesus in the air, which makes, if he comes back over Israel, we got a long way to go to get there. But we'll go up and then across the ocean. Okay, I used to think about these things, and then it's about the tribulation, which is a 7-year period of awfulness on planet Earth at the hand of God's judgment, and then there will be let's say a second coming, the victory of Jesus in the Battle of Armageddon, the millennium for 1,000 years. And then Satan will be loosed, and then there will be eternity. That's what most people think of when they think of dispensationalism. Now, how does it distinguish from us? I believe that approach to reading the book of Revelation creates people who are always speculating about who in our modern world is doing what, or who identifies with whom in the book of Revelation's characters. So it's always about speculation. It's always about identifying. It's always trying to figure out who in the modern world fits. So is it Putin now? That's the one that people would be asking. Our approach is about discipleship. And it asks, how do the 7 churches live faithfully following Jesus in a world that is controlled by the Roman Empire, which John castigates as Babylon, as the whore of Babylon in Revelation 17 through 19. So it's a book about first century Christian living that is capable of showing believers how to live today in the light of government corruption. So it's a discipleship manual for what we call, this is real seminary language, but I love it. The editors wouldn't let us use it. It's a theopolitical discipleship.
Okay,
it teaches us how to follow the politics of God in a world that is out of control. That's correct.
Well, and that's what makes this approach so applicable to our time. Yes. At the Denison Forum, we are trying to mobilize the church, particularly in our part of the world here in the Americas, toward a new spiritual awakening. That we believe that there is a rising tide of opposition to biblical Christianity, and that we need to be equipped and prepared through not only the book of Revelation, but many other parts of the Bible as well, to what it means to live in an environment where Christianity is no longer simply respected or maybe even considered irrelevant, but is now considered dangerous. And living in that kind of a world of opposition. But it was for me in reading through the book, freeing to see it through a discipleship lens rather than calendar, clocks, and maps, and, which
like
Yeah.
which going back and I'm sure y'all have had much more experience with this than I have, but it's just interesting how many people try to attach modern day figures and events
Yeah.
to things in the book of Revelation. And then when they're wrong, they go through a revision and we've got a whole new set to work with. And Cody, has that been some of what you encountered and kind of what caused some despair?
Yeah, I think that's part of what caused avoidance and despair. That's certainly true. If everyone, and I think we need to take this pretty seriously, if everyone who's ever made predictions based on the book of Revelation to this point has been wrong, at some point we should probably slow down and ask ourselves, is this the right way to read this book?
Yeah.
And it certainly is not the right way to read this book. I think, part of what you just said, I think is really helpful, Mark, which is Michael Gorman, towards the beginning of his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, which is another really great book, he says, he's the one who coined this idea of theopolitical, but Revelation is written to control fear, to sort of renew commitment, and to sustain vision. And those three are really helpful because oftentimes these, as you said, calendars, clocks, and maps, they often induce fear. They don't help us control our fear. They don't help us renew our commitment. They move us to try to escape. And they don't sustain much of a vision other than a kind of arrogance in the moment of thinking that we're the ones who are finally going to figure it out. And so, yeah, I've seen plenty of this. My experience working with young adults in particular, I'm 35, so I'm not young, but I'm not old. I'm in this funny stage of life. But most of the younger people that I pastor, they avoid Revelation and despair. They know that clocks, calendars, and maps are not the right way to read it, but they don't know what is the right way to read it, and so they sort of avoid it in despair.
Right. And that's, Scott, could you kind of give us a little bit more context? If I understand from what you put in the book, dispensational approach and interpretation is not very old historically. It's a relatively recent way of interpreting and reading the Bible. And then could you flesh out a little bit more what you mean by pop dispensationalism? What's the difference between that and more historic dispensationalism?
Now, what was that first question again?
Yeah, is dispensational interpretation,
New.
is it fairly new when we look across 2,000 years of history from the writing of the New Testament?
I guess I could quote Solomon and say there's nothing new under the sun. And we could start with that. In a sense, it's not brand new, but what happened with John Nelson Darby, basically, was a refashioning of different elements that were not put together in the history of the church. And it started to become a Christian eschatology that over time flourished among ordinary Christians who were pious, believers, Bible readers, English Bible readers, and I would add a little jab here without a clue of the Jewish world. And then it wasn't until you get people like Cyrus C.I. Scofield, who did the Scofield Bible and was involved in training people to think this way about the Bible, that it became, in a sense, a more intellectual discipline, dispensationalism. But it never really became truly academic until Louis Sperry Chafer wrote an 8-volume systematic theology when he was a professor at Dallas Seminary, and he was a Presbyterian at the time. So it kind of messes things up to think about the origins. But when I was in college, I bought, or I think maybe I was given, the 8-volume systematic theology of Louis Sperry Chafer, and I read quite a bit of it. He was a really clear writer, and everything was put together very well. But it was in the Dallas Seminary, let's say in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, that dispensationalism really took off. And I could be wrong on the dates. I'm not quite sure when Dallas began. But a recent book by Daniel Hummel called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism has told this whole story. I think it is fair to say, though, that dispensationalism as we know it is a 20th century phenomenon. It is not an early Christian belief. And
then,
it was not the accepted theological system of the majority of fundamentalists or evangelicals, but it became so through pop dispensationalism, which was mediated to us not through Salem Kurbad, though he should be given more credit, through Hal Lindsey's book, which sold 10 million copies in the first decade. And that right there just sort of, and then you had Thief in the Night. I've never heard of The Omen that you brought up, but the Thief in the Night movie, all these things just made dispensationalism, both its way of reading the Bible and those ideas that were important, so easy to understand that evangelicalism, as a general rule, became dispensational. And
right.
what many of us grew up with. I mean, the instincts of the ordinary evangelical are dispensational.
Right. Yeah, and again, another one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is just to help people get that framework in many ways. Cody, let me get you to respond to this. One of the things that you outline in the early part of the book is that reading the book of Revelation, not as discipleship, but as escapism, is a real danger. And you hear this commonly, at least I did as a pastor in 4 churches across 34 years. Well, I don't know. The general approach would be, anytime it came up for most people, was, I don't know about all those things in the book of Revelation. I just know that Jesus wins. Why is that a very, very poor way to think about this part of Scripture?
Yeah, I would express some sympathy at first, and just probably want to say up front, as someone who follows Jesus, I think that reading Revelation from the lens that Jesus wins is not a bad place to start. So I'm sympathetic to that from the onset. Yeah, I think that to put it really boldly, I would say that I think escapist approaches to Revelation, in one sense, are toothless. They're a little bit spineless. They don't really move us towards the imperative of the New Testament. For Jesus, follow me. I'm reading through Mark's gospel in my personal time right now. I'm in the early chapters, and it's calls to follow Jesus. And Paul, he's working for the moral formation of the people in the cities that they're in, to be disciples in their context. And Revelation, the way we've come to read Revelation, it really just says, hey, all you need to do is pray this one prayer, hold on tight, and eventually you're going to get skyrocketed out of here. A friend sent me a meme recently that had said we should stop putting caskets in the ground this way and start putting them upwards, so that we can just get skyrocketed out of here. And of course, I think at one point in time, people who wrote on Revelation, maybe like you, Scott, got sent roadmaps and wacky things. I get sent funny memes from my younger friends about some of these, more wacky readings of Revelation. But I would say, to answer your question, if the call is to follow Jesus as disciples, to be discipled in the way of Jesus in our world, then these readings of Revelation that move us to escape are actually producing the opposite in us. And that's why there's such a danger to the church, and why they're causing so much malformation in the church, because they're effectively saying, you don't have any role to play in this world. God hasn't called you to do anything but to hold on. And the reality is, Jesus actually calls us to be witnesses as we worship here and for the renewal of our cities. And so I think it fundamentally fails the entire ethic of the New Testament.
Do you believe a 5th Great Awakening is possible in America? At Denison Forum, we're asking God that we might play a role in His movement in our country. We believe that discerning news from a biblical perspective can help all Christians stand for God in our increasingly secular culture. If you likewise stand with our mission, please give today toward our summer campaign at dfpodcast.org. Very good. Very helpful. Scott, the foundation of this book that you and Cody have put together is really in the subtitle, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as dissident disciples. What is dissident discipleship?
Okay. To be a dissident, you have to have something that you're resisting, that you're fighting against, that you're a dissident to. And in the book of Revelation, as you begin to read the book, it starts out with this amazing vision of Jesus. And then all of a sudden there's these so-called letters to 7 churches. And that sounds like pretty ordinary Christian stuff, although it's a little more formulaic than Paul's letters and a whole lot shorter, even shorter than Philemon. But then you get 2 amazing vision chapters of the throne room and of the lamb, the lion and the lamb, in chapters 4 and 5. And then all of a sudden we're launched for how many chapters? 11, 6 through 16, all about these divine disciplines or judgments that are directed against the evil of this world. And then we get to 17, and suddenly we get this amazing vision of the whore of Babylon. And it's just so graphic and descriptive. And it goes on for most of 3 chapters. And all of a sudden we realize there's the problem in this letter. Rome is Babylon, and Babylon is the problem. And to be a dissident is to live in the Roman Empire as someone who will not compromise following Jesus with the Roman Empire, with Babylon, but lives as a resistor of Babylon in 2 ways. First, in the public discipleship life of resisting the way of Babylon in our ordinary life. And John spells this out in chapters 17 and 18, and we spell it out in 7 categories. And then the other way they are dissidents is they resist the Babylon creep in local churches, so that when Babylon begins to creep its way into the churches, of the 7 churches, Ephesus, Laodicea, Sardis, etc., John wants them to be able to see that Babylon is creeping in as well. So dissident is a double dissident. It's a dissident against Babylon in the public sector and a dissident against Babylon in the church. But John gives us categories to understand what Babylon stands for. And these are really important, Mark. They are idolatry, or being anti-God. He sees this as a major problem. You cannot walk through Ephesus even today with all the archaeological stuff that's there and not recognize that there was all kinds of temptations to idolatry, or at least the presence of idolatry. Opulence is the second one. The woman's dress she's full of bling and high level, whatever you want to call it. She's dressed in the finest. They are murderous, and so the blood of the martyrs is on their hands. And the woman of Babylon, or Babylon, is opposed to the people of God and is killing people. Plus, Rome killed everybody. There is an image sense, is that everything about Rome was about its image. Everywhere you went, Rome reminded you that you were there. Now, if we go to Washington, D.C., Cody doesn't have to do this because he's a Canadian. All right. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you go to the major buildings, they are massive reminders of the vision of the United States, the sort of Greco-Roman vision, as well as the power of this state. Then, and Rome did this all, everywhere you went, you saw Rome. They were militaristic, and they conquered countries to exploit their resources, to steal bodies and make them slaves. This is in Revelation 7:18. And they exploited everything. So in Revelation 18, we have this list of all the cargo that is shipped from around the Mediterranean world to Rome. And that's all about exploitation. And then the primary characteristic of Babylon is arrogance, the arrogance of domination. So if you don't mind me making a political statement, they all wore a red hat that said, "Make Rome great again."
Wow.
It had that sort of mentality of greatness, that they were the greatest country. And in fact, they were the greatest country in the history of civilization until that time. They knew it. And the whore of Babylon says that we will never grieve. No one will ever touch us. So that's what the concern is.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, then you're saying that to be a dissident disciple, there is a personal application of pursuing biblical holiness rather than accommodation and compromise on a personal level, kind of what Paul lays out in Romans 12 when he says, "Don't be conformed to this world." There's obviously the strong biblical call to personal holiness, but there's also a congregational call that you do not adopt the values, standards, methodologies of what the culture is doing, what the political economic system that you may find yourself in, what they have valued. You live instead congregationally in a different way, and then you live that out communally within the context of whatever geopolitical environment you've been put in. Because one of the things we have to remember about the book of Revelation and the whole rest of the Bible is it's for the whole world, whether you're living in a republic like ours, or you're living in a communist country, or you're living in a Middle Eastern country or China. It's this book, and this part of the book is to be applicable to all believers in all ages in all of those contexts. Am I on the right page with you?
Yes. Here's what I would say, though. Yeah, and I totally agree with what you said, but just let me make this comment. Paul's statement, "Don't be conformed to this world," is nowhere near as fun as the Babylon image in Revelation 17 to 19.
Okay.
But I would say Babylon is John's word that John uses elsewhere, but Paul uses for the world and for the flesh. That's what Babylon is.
Right, and love how your book, you skipped ahead of me a little bit, but the idea that Babylon is a trope or a figure of speech for essentially the mentality of the world that is separated from Christ. Am I saying it well?
Yes, stronger than that. It is a trope for, let's say, a city and a government and a system that is opposed to the work of God in this world. So it's a corrupted, systemic, political government that is opposed to the work of God in the Lamb in this world.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think that is seeking to form its own, ideal versions of citizens, to habituate those citizens, to transform those citizens, to create their ideal version of those who inhabit the city. And that's reinforced by the sort of propaganda machines that try to reinforce whatever things those might be, whether it be, in John's context, we see that with the beast of the land and the beast of the sea, but we see that in various ways in our own context as well. The ways in which these systems, these structures that get set up, these empires, that their way of living is the way that you want to move with their current, not against their current, or else.
Yeah,
and
right.
We have similarities to that in all sorts of the places you mentioned, Mark, of course.
Well, let's get a little bit down into the meats and potatoes of this book, because one of the things that you have to do, or at least I have to do, is I think it was Warren Wiersbe said that you had to read the Bible with imagination. And I've for all of my Christian life, I've heard people say that if I could only have one part of the book, I'd read the Gospel of John. And I've come to have growing, deeper appreciation for that. But I've always leaned much more heavily toward Paul. I just feel like I think in those categories and in those ways of thinking more. I have this theory that John was a musician and an artist, and Paul spent his time in other parts of the seminary, if you will, and that maybe one of the reasons I have a hard time is because I'm totally not creative in that sense as an artist or a musician. But you make a note in the as you start to unpack this understanding that to read Revelation is to see it as a play, as a script with a play where there are characters, lots of different kinds of characters, and undergirding or coming through this play, which if you've ever traveled, as our audience is listening, you go to the Holy Land, you will visit, as you do in Ephesus and other places, these amazing theaters where they would, they didn't have movie theaters or podcasts. They had actual live theaters where you can stand in them today and they can hold thousands of people and everybody would have been able to hear. The acoustic creation that they came up with was magnificent, but this was their entertainment. This was also how they were formed in many ways through story that were being acted out on the stage, both for Roman formation as well as other opportunities. But help us unpack that image for us that when you read the book of Revelation, you're reading a certain kind of literature, and you use the idea of a play with a playbill. Can y'all kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it can be understood as a drama of different characters playing different roles, and two sides, two teams. We call them Team Dragon and Team Lamb, and each one of them has characters. But the book also has a plot. There's something as you're going through the book of Revelation, there are things happening so that eventually Team Dragon loses, Team Lamb wins, and they all enter into the New Jerusalem. That's the big picture of this book, and it's quite a drama. But it requires, I believe, the ability of the listener or the reader to hear, let's say, listen to the words and let those words stimulate the imagination to watch the drama unfold before our eyes. It's so important to do this because John stops the flow of this book. It's like he's got a drama on the stage and there's a couple other little stages on the side that all of a sudden the lights on the main stage go off and he puts us over here on this little stage, and then he puts us on another stage. Then we go back to the main stage. Then we go to these. It's all these interruptions. Interludes is what they're often called. And John wants us to see these things happening, and he wants to stimulate our imagination. And if we, this is big for us. If we start trying to imagine these things happening literally on planet Earth, it gets really wacky. But if we allow these to be drama, I wouldn't want to say it's strictly fictional, but there's a fictional dimension to it. It's like reading The Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia or Heavens for those who have read Harry Potter, because I've not read one word. It has to do with your ability to enter into that world and let that world shape you. And then you come back into this world like the Pevensie children did when they came back out of Narnia through the wardrobe and back into the big house. All of a sudden, they're different people because of the imaginative world that they've encountered. That's how I think we need to read this book.
So in a sense, there are like many plays, there are acts and interludes that work their way out throughout the story, the telling of this story. And I love the way the book helped me understand that. Okay, well, we're gonna tell you who the characters are before the play begins, before the drama begins, so that you kind of have an understanding of who these characters are. Cody, one of the things that I don't know why, but this has never dawned on me in my biblical studies. The thing that y'all point out, that when John is exiled to Patmos and receives this revelation, that Patmos is not an isolated, abandoned island where there's nobody around. So explain that a little bit, and in terms of the context in what John was experiencing when he was exiled to this island, and why would he choose to use such an imaginative way of trying to call people to a level of total discipleship? Why would he use this methodology to do that?
Yeah, it was almost a year ago, actually, that Scott and I were on Patmos together, and we went to the cave where John allegedly had his visions. I mean, those who have done these trips, for those of you who end up getting to go, and it's a life-changing opportunity to go to these locations, to be in these places. But they have lots of stories, about this is so-and-so's tomb, and this is the 17 places where Jesus was crucified. But we went to the cave where allegedly John had his visions. And there was this crack in the ceiling that was like a triangle crack. And they said, this is a triangle because of the Trinity. And the visions came out. Anyway, it's a whole thing. And we came out and Scott said to me, that's a little hokey. Hey. And I was like, yeah, we know he was somewhere on this island. All that to say, John was in Ephesus. We say this in the book, John was teaching these ideas. He was a follower of Jesus. And I think looking back, it really does feel like the response of Rome to move John, who's a really prominent Christian figure at the time, it seems disproportionate. I mean, why do you go after, a guy who's helping lead a pocket full of house churches, singing some spirituals? They saw what he was teaching as threatening in the sense that they want to at least move him, not necessarily to imprison him or put him on a penal colony, but at least to move him to this island. And so John says, he gets caught up in a vision. So the Spirit of God moves in such a way that John has these visions. Part of the language of Revelation that's so strong is what John saw and what John heard. And saw for John is something like in his mind's eye. He sees something. He's inspired to see what's really going on sort of behind the curtain, which is what the word apocalypse really means. And so, I'll turn it over to Scott in a second, but one of the things that I've realized is, John has these visions. And when you try to move from having a vision to putting it on paper, it's a bit of a tough move to figure out what images do you use? How do you best explain it? And it seems like John is all over the place doing two things at once. He's referencing the Hebrew Bible, which modestly he seems to allude to the Old Testament, not cite it, but allude to it maybe over 300 times. And at the same time, he's also using images that would have been really prominent in his Roman world. And so that's part of why it has such a bizarre legacy, is there's so much Hebrew Bible, there's so much Rome, and John is wedding them together in this genre of literature that's meant, as Scott said, to inspire imagination. You want to add to that, Scott?
Well, no, Patmos was not a penal colony, but, he didn't have Wi-Fi, and he didn't have carrier pigeons, probably, who could carry
or
these
owls,
things
to come back to Harry Potter.
The house? I don't know about Harry
The owls.
Owls.
Sorry, yes.
Okay. All right. So really putting him out there on this island is really taking him out of the orbit of these churches. And I have to think that John 7, he was sort of like a bishop of 7 churches, and that he was conveying these messages that we have in the book of Revelation in such a way that he was a nuisance to authorities, at least to one authority who had the power to put him out on Patmos. And so I think that's why he's there. John tells us because of the testimony of Jesus, which many people have read, and I do, as because he was a witness to Jesus. So he was, in a sense, persecuted. But Patmos, as I told the group when we got to Patmos, and I've said this every time I've gotten there, this is not a bad gig.
Yeah,
that's right.
It is not.
It is a beautiful place.
It is.
And the first century, it was more beautiful.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Cody, a minute ago. I've had a chance to do a few Bible study tours to Israel, to Jerusalem. And what we tell people is you have to think in A, B, and C. A means that it happened somewhere around here. It might have been within, I don't know, anywhere from 100 to 200 miles. And somebody put something up here. It might be a building, it might be a monument, but they put up something to memorialize this thing or person that we see in the Bible. But we're just within, 100 or 200 miles. The level B is, okay, well, we know it happened probably within about 50 miles of here. And then there are some places, not large in number, but there are a few places, at least in Israel, where you can say, okay, it was here that it happened. And we try to make that distinction for our folks when they're there. But when we know this, when we take an airplane over there, we're a whole lot closer to where these things happen than we are on this side of the world.
I was thinking the same thing. I know my feet are on the same island that John was on. I can say that for sure.
That's right.
And that's pretty profound in and of itself. And when you're in a few spots in Jerusalem, you can say, you know what, I could be standing in the very spot where Jesus stood one day. And that's that's pretty profound. Let's talk a little bit as you move toward the latter part of the book. Somebody is going to be asking, okay, is New Jerusalem a real place in a real time? Just give me the short answer to that, because there's going to be some people asking me that question.
Okay, I'm going to say no, but just think about it this way: it's a 1,400 kilometer, about 1,000-mile cube, high as wide, which is basically about the space of the Roman Empire. Okay, so it's basically saying the Roman Empire is all moved here. And I don't know what you do with an apartment building that is 1,000 miles high. Okay, I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I think instead of looking at it as literal, I think we should look at it as a symbol of virtual perfection. And it's ornate. It's got these amazing foundations, these amazing pillars, these amazing gates. It's got this river flowing through it, and it's healing. The leaves can heal the nations. It's got gates that don't even have to be closed at night because it's so safe. This is a symbol of the fact that someday God is going to make all things right, and that the way of Babylon, the way of Rome, will be defeated, and that the way of God, the way of the Lamb, will be established and instituted in a place that will be safe for the people of God who want to live with the Lamb. So, yes, it's a place, but it's not I just can't imagine any kind of life inside a 1,000 square.
I think I hear you saying, Scott, we shouldn't literalize these images, but they are our sure hope. And it's also important to say that all of the promises to those 7 churches are about that New Jerusalem. So what God has promised to those churches and to us, we will receive that, maybe just not in a 1,000-foot high apartment building or whatever. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, so let's don't make the theological error of saying that seventh heaven that Paul says he was caught up into was what John saw when he was having this revelation. Let's don't make that linkage if we can avoid it. But as you kind of move to the conclusion of the book, you talk in very profound ways about the meantime, that if you're reading this book as a disciple and you're seeking to become the best dissident, salt and light disciple that you can be by hearing what God is saying through this book and through John, you talk about in the meantime, and we live in a very mean time. I live in a part of the world where the most recent random mass shooting just occurred, 5 miles from me, and took the lives of 8 people, including several children. So we live in a very mean time. And you talk about the significance of worship and the responsibility and privilege of witness. Can the two of you kind of unpack that as kind of the real meat of this is how you survive, we thrive, we flourish as dissident disciples through worship and for the purpose of witness? Talk about that a little bit.
Cody, I don't think you've heard me say this. 3 W's. Wisdom, witness, worship. We use discernment, but you have to discern. But I'll talk about witness, and Cody can talk about worship. Or do you want to talk about? Okay, I'll talk. Witness in the gospel, in the book of Revelation, has some major important dimensions. One is that Jesus is the ultimate witness. He lived the witness. He's the witness. The second thing is witness is something that we have seen, heard, or experienced, to which we verbally make a statement of, we saw it, we heard it, we were there. So it's an experiential reality. And then the next dimension of it is that because we have seen and heard and experienced, we lay our lives on the line and we become the witness. And that sense of witness can be a martyr, where our bodies embody faithfulness to the Lamb. That is what it means to be a witness. So it is, I've even heard people say it only refers to our life. And this is just fundamental misunderstanding of the word. The word always is about a verbal witness to our experience. But it's the experience of the witness of Jesus that we witness to, and then we lay our lives on the line, and we become, in a sense, an embodiment of witness by the way our lives are conducted. So that's what John wants of his people, to have the wisdom to recognize Babylon, and to become a witness in this world. And worship is the third W.
Yeah, and for worship, I mean, we point to this in, what's corrupted in the churches that Jesus is critiquing. And of course, as Scott mentioned a few minutes ago, that the Babylon creep has happened in such a way that their worship has become tainted. I think, at least in the Western church, we have a worship problem. And Revelation all over the place, not just chapters 4 and 5. We're used to seeing those as worship scenes. But those interludes that we mentioned in our book, what we see in Revelation is this spiral of chaos that's happening. Seal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then John raptures us, if you will, into this worshipful scene of Mount Zion and hope. And these are supposed to move us to the right type of worship. And to see actually that we worship not alone, we worship with a great cloud of witnesses. And we are being shaped and formed in and through what we worship. One thing about chapter 4 that I've always found really fascinating is we all know the scene. John sees the throne and the elders, they're casting down their crowns, all the great Revelation worship songs that have been written because of these lines. And when you see the dragon and the beasts later on, they have their crowns. They have not casted any crowns. There is no worship to the Lamb that's coming from them. And I think there's something in that image that John would want as a little seed in our minds of, are we willing to sort of throw down these crowns? Because if we're not, we would put ourselves in league with the unholy Trinity, actually. And we're worshiping things that are pseudo or false. And as we worship the Lamb, we become like the Lamb. John wants us to know that. Yeah.
Well, the other thing about these songs, the worship, is African-American New Testament scholar named Brian Blount has pointed out that these songs evoke the African-American spirituals, which were at one level songs that they learned from their slave masters, that actually, when you knew what the African-American slaves were singing, were subversive. And I think that is so important to these songs in Revelation, is that those who sing these songs are not singing such songs to the emperor. They are songs of resistance and dissidence. And Cody was right. We have a worship problem. If we would worship the Lamb, we would become so theopolitically wise and discerning that we would recognize Babylon in our world and become witnesses. How's that for a summary in the book of Revelation?
That's a pretty good summary right there. And so what that says to me, as like I said, my primary context being that of pastor of churches is how can we read this book as a corrective to our worship? And that worship is, in this mean time that we live in, it is to be both the gathering of the people to share what their eyes, ears, and soul have actually seen and heard of the movement of God in their life over a 7-day period, if you want to, as well as a crying out for it, a longing for it in the sense of that idea of a spiritual song that is both testimony and plea. And how do we how does this book become a corrective to some of our worship in that way? That's just the way that hits me initially.
Yeah, well, I think it does do that. Is that, I've often said it this way: if we would worship the Lamb the way the Book of Revelation teaches us, we will be more discerning of political corruption and corruption in the churches. And if we learn to focus on New Jerusalem, we will become less and less mesmerized by Babylon. If we love the woman of Revelation 12, we will learn not to love the woman of Revelation 17 and 18.
Yeah, so well. Well, we're about to wind up our time together, but one last kind of question for both of you would be, how do you feel like misreading the book of Revelation is hurting? We talked about this a little bit already, but how is it hurting the church? And what, if anything else other than what we've already shared, would you want people to hear from this conversation?
Yeah, one of the things that I've said often, my Canadian context is different than the American context, and I have also been a part of pastoring lots of young adults. And so I would say it's easy for many of us to have a kind of schadenfreude, as Scott has so eloquently taught me over time, which is a celebration over, a comeuppance, someone else's really getting it from God, and I'm going to celebrate that. I think that many of us see ourselves on the side of the victor, and we're celebrating Babylons that are being torn down. But the real danger, at least in my context, and maybe for younger people, is I think that they think they're building the New Jerusalem, and what they cannot yet see is they're actually building the next iteration of Babylon. And so they're celebrating the fall of a former Babylon, and unbeknownst to them, they need vision to see that they're actually contributing to the building of a new one. And so I think that this kind of worship, seeing Revelation, seeing the Lamb as the Lamb, the slaughtered and slain and standing, as John says, witness, will, as Scott said, move us to the right types of worship. But I think it will also cause us maybe to try to see the efforts of our hands and the things that we're giving ourselves to with more clarity, ironically. So I think that for me, I see this pervasive danger to think that we're the heroes. And I think that we need to follow the Lamb wherever he goes, as John says. Yeah.
And I think it will teach us, the book of Revelation will teach us to discern corruption in the church, corruption in society, and it will teach us that following the Lamb is the deepest challenge that any human being can embrace in our world today. And we live in a world where following the Lamb is becoming increasingly difficult, whether it's because of opposition or it's because we live in such a secular age that we can't even recognize secularity any longer. And John wants to create for us a completely different vision of what this world is all about, what the church is all about, and what the Christian life is all about.
Wow. Well, thanks to both of you, not only for your conversation today, but for this work. You're making John's discipleship manual more accessible to a generation of people. And that is a tremendous gift. It certainly, like I said, reconnected me to some of the early beginnings of where the Holy Spirit was getting my attention, and has brought me to a really, really fresh place of appreciation for looking for these principles and truths and encouragements and challenges about how to be a dissident disciple in this meantime. So thank you both, and thank you for this conversation. I look forward to engaging with you again on other topics. I want to thank our podcast audience. If you have been blessed by this conversation, go and check out the book by Scot McKnight and Cody Matchett called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. You can find it at all major booksellers, and please rate, review our podcast, share it with others so that they can be a part of the conversation as well. And we'll see you next time on the Denison Forum podcast.